Welcome, I'm David Damore, the Executive Director of the Lindsay Institute in Brookings Mountain West. This is the inaugural Robert E. Lang Memorial Fellowship Lecture. Thank you so much for attending today. After Rob's passing, that never gets easy, we wanted to honor and sustain his legacy. This quickly coalesced around the idea of establishing a fellowship for UNLV PhD students completing dissertations related to urban public policy. The fellowship serves as a dissertation completion grant that provides recipients with the time and resources to focus on the research without having to teach or work for faculty members. Most of Rob's teaching was at the graduate level, and he was a strong advocate for graduate education. He was the first to note back in 2010 that Nevada was the most populous state without an R1 institution, and the implications this had for the state's research and development capacity. One of the key R1 metrics is PhD completions. As we were finalizing the fellowship's parameters, Bill Brown suggested that at the end of their fellowship year, fellows present their research at a community forum. This too is part of Rob's ethos. He was the rare scholar who could drive policy change by using public lectures, convenings, and events to frame issues and solutions. In this room, Rob made the case for the UNLV Medical School, now the Kirk Kerkorian School of Medicine at UNLV. He encouraged the community and pushed the community to support light rail. We will, of course, soon regret that, if we don't already. And this is where the seeds for higher education reform were sown. The fellowship and lecture personifies Rob's vision of graduate education and using research to inform public policy. Before I introduce our speaker, some thank yous. I want to thank, of course, UNLV TV, who's recording this event as they do all of our events. This will be available by the end of the week, and we'll blast this out through email. I want to thank Ashley Leclerc, Caitlin Saladino, and our team for pulling this event together. Excellent work as always. And lastly, I want to note and thank the donors, because without their support and their generosity, the Robert E. Lang Memorial Fellowship would just simply be an idea on a piece of paper. So many of you are here today. Thank you so much for your support. Mallory Constantine is of Las Vegas. She graduated from Silverado High School and earned her BA and MA from UNLV. She is now completing her PhD in clinical psychology under the guidance of Chris Carney, who I believe is here. There's Chris back there. Mallory's dissertation research is heartbreaking and raises important questions about how services are administered to Nevada's most vulnerable and neglected children. Her research interests intersect with areas that are a focus of our own work, including nonprofits, social services, health, education, and government. Join me in welcoming our inaugural Lang Fellow, Mallory Constantine.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all being here and for supporting me today. I really appreciate it. Let's see if the clicker will work. Nope, it's still not gonna work, so I'm gonna do this instead. So as we get started, I just wanna take this rare opportunity to thank all of those who have supported me throughout my doctoral process, specifically my family and my friends, as well as my faculty and clinical supervisors. And I want to extend an appreciated thank you to my research advisor, Dr. Christopher Carney, and also my sincerest appreciation for the staff at the Lindsay Institute and Brookings Mountain West for believing in me and for believing in my research this year. So we're going to talk about how and why foster care impacts maltreated youth school performance. Before we get started, I just want to say that we are going to be talking about maltreatment and the foster care system, and this information sometimes can be overwhelming depending on individual life experiences. So please feel free to take a break if you need it, either mentally or stepping out of the room if you need to. So before we fully jump in, I want to introduce myself and some of the lenses that I bring to my research. So my family moved here when I was 4 years old to Southern Nevada, and so very much home does me Nevada. Like was mentioned, I graduated high school here and was part of the public education system. Through those experiences, I had several friends who were at differing levels of involvement within the foster care system. And I very vividly remember the first time I had a friend who expressed to me that when his mom got mad, she would hit him very hard. And a couple of weeks later, that friend was no longer at school. And as an adult, I can recognize that this friend was likely involved in the foster care system at that point in time and probably transferred schools. However, as a youth, this experience was really confusing. And so as I continued to go throughout my education, those experiences were something that I held close and remembered. I do also want to say that I have never been involved in the CPS system. So from that lens, there are going to be things that I simply don't understand on a very lived experience basis. However, I try really hard to be rooted in the research and through looking at those youths' lived experiences so that I'm centering their voices and their perspectives. As was mentioned earlier, I moved out of state for a couple of years and then decided that Nevada was the best state and quickly moved back to finish my degree at UNLV for undergraduate. And then I applied to the clinical psychology doctoral program here at UNLV as well. I, through that training, have become and worked hard to become a trauma clinician and a trauma researcher. Additionally, I want to state that I recognize that as a white person doing research with youth who are predominantly from minoritized groups and hold minoritized identities, again, there's going to be a layer of this that I'm not fully going to understand, but I have worked hard to try to check some of those lenses, as well as incorporate my understanding through their research and centering their voices. This year, I'm completing my intensive clinical training at UNLV CAPS, providing trauma care for many of UNLV's students. And I also want to say that I have had a much fuller experience in my last year by being awarded the Robert E. Lang Fellowship. The staff at the Lindsay Institute in Brookings Mountain West has allowed me to have a deeper understanding of the ways that our research influence policy and policy can influence our research. And without those opportunities, I'm not sure I would have had as full of a dissertation experience. So I appreciate that, the opportunity for that experience as well. So as we start to talk about the foster care system in Nevada, I think it's important to understand the overall context of where Nevada is at right now with regards to children's mental health. In October of 2022, the Department of Justice filed a report stating that it determined Nevada to be in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, stating specifically that we failed to provide adequate community-based services to children with behavioral health disabilities. Within that same report, it also stated that Nevada fails to connect children to the necessary community supports to allow them to integrate successfully back into the community once they have been in systems and institutions. I think what perhaps one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this report is that there's mention that many families turn to the Department of Family Services and are relinquishing their rights to their children because there are no behavioral health supports. And so they are effectively placing their children in the foster care system due to the lack of system for that mental health access here in Nevada. And so certainly as we go through, we'll talk about individual traumatic experiences and how those can play a role in school performance. But I think it's also really important to keep in mind that the systems and the policies that these children and youth interact with on a day-to-day basis are also going to impact the way that they function in the classroom. Because within being placed in those systems is a traumatic experience in and of itself. Okay, so again, just for a little bit of background to know what this process of home removal looks like for these youth. So as you can see, it's a multi-step process, and this is actually a very simplified version of the process here in Nevada. However, the process will start when a professional or community member will report suspected maltreatment to CPS. At that point in time, a CPS worker will screen the referral. And one of two things will happen. They'll say that the referral does not meet the state's criteria for a referral to become a report and be screened out. Some of that criteria is that child maltreatment of some sort has occurred, and that a child is potentially at harm's way. Once, if a report, or if that referral is screened in and becomes a report, it is at that time that those allegations have been substantiated, and they want to be referred for further investigation and initial safety assessment. That assessment process includes determining if there are current safety concerns and potential risk for the child. If there's no safety concerns, that case is going to be closed. If there are safety concerns and present risk for future harm, these youth will then go into a further assessment where they're trying to determine, is that risk low or is that moderate or high? If it's low, that family will be referred to voluntary services or potentially their case will be closed. However, if there is a substantiated safety risk or some type of ongoing risk for that youth, at that point in time, they'll be placed into protective custody. So as you can see, it's a pretty long process. And as you can imagine, for these youth, going through that process in and of itself is emotionally taxing. And there's a lot of uncertainty throughout that entire process that certainly plays a role in how these kids are showing up at school. Okay. So reasons for home removal. So reasons for home removal can differ state by state depending on policies. However, these are some of the most common for Nevada specifically. So I think when people are thinking about what it means to be involved in the foster care system, there's kind of this automatic thought that maltreatment has happened and that's the sole reason that you can get into the foster care system. That's not fully accurate. There's many reasons why a child can be placed in the foster care system, but certainly experiencing maltreatment is a portion of that. So there are 4 main types of maltreatment, one being neglect, physical maltreatment, sexual maltreatment, or emotional or psychological maltreatment. So when we're talking about neglect, we're talking about a failure to meet a child's basic physical and psychosocial needs. These are things such as housing, clothing, food, medical care, supervision, attention or affection. We are switching to talk about physical maltreatment. That looks very different. That is a very deliberate, aggressive, or violent behavior towards a child that often results in physical injury. And this can be seen in things like hitting, punching, kicking, choking, burning, so on and so forth. Sexual maltreatment is something that includes the act of force, whether that's through threats or physical force, to violate or exploit children into engaging in sexual acts that they cannot consent in and that are unwanted. So this could be things like rape, fondling, exposure to, or participation in sexual activities. Emotional and psychological maltreatment in and of itself is not a reason that youth are removed from their homes. However, it typically coincides with these other types of maltreatment. So we're seeing, it's very rare to also just see emotional and psychological maltreatment. I will also say that. So when we mean emotional or psychological maltreatment, that means things like verbal assault, denying emotional responsiveness, isolation, corrupting, exploiting, terrorizing, humiliating or otherwise harassing or trying to control a child. So as we move down the list, those are just some of the reasons. We also see educational neglect being a reason that youth are removed from their homes. By definition, that has to occur within school age, so children ages 7 to 17. And what it fully means is denying children opportunities for learning in a way that is impacting their overall development. So typically that can look like absences from school to a significant degree that aren't substantiated and there's no real identifiable reason, or otherwise trying to limit their education. We also see abandonment, so referring back to that Department of Justice report, that is a common reason that we're seeing youth here in Nevada be referred for being removed from their home because parents don't know how to attend to their children's needs without the system's support. We also see things like parental death. So if parents in the home die and there's nobody who can be a caretaker for them, that's another reason youth can be brought into the foster care system, as well as domestic violence. So domestic violence specifically refers to when two adults are physically harming each other. Typically, a youth is not being harmed in those instances, but can be witnessing those events, as well as inadequate housing or homelessness as a reason for being placed in the foster care system. So foster care placements in Nevada, I first want to draw your attention to the red box at the end of the screen. As you can see, the overall amount of youth that are in foster care in Nevada is going down. And I think initially that can seem like we're doing a good thing, that things are going really well. However, if we hold that in context with the COVID-19 pandemic, research is actually showing that instances of child maltreatment likely rose due to parent stress, parental isolation, economic hardships. So why do we see this number going down? It's the lack of access to mandatory reporters that these children have. So when they're not going to school, they're not coming into contact with people who would typically be seeing these things and reporting these things. So we're seeing that reduction. So we would anticipate that that number to go back to what it was pre-pandemic within the upcoming years. In the state of Nevada, on average, on any given month, we have about 4,001 youth in the foster care system. And what that breaks down to by counties is 2,973 foster youth in Clark County, 623 in Washoe County, and 405 in the rural regions. These numbers become very alarming when you hold them in context of the number of total beds for foster and groups homes in Nevada for these foster youth. So we have about 3,003 total beds and 4,000 foster youth. So we're working at a deficit on any given month of about 1,000 placements. So what does this mean practically, and what are the practical implications of this? So practically, it looks like overcrowding in group homes. So at Child Haven, it looks like beds in the hallways and children needing to find places to sleep. Additionally, it also looks like higher placement turnover. So if there's a youth who, say, their caregiver is potentially not a good match for them, there's a quicker turnaround time because there's another youth who needs a bed. So there is more of a likelihood that they're going to kind of be switched out, trying to find some of those placements to make them work. Additionally, we also see higher levels of foster care provider burnout. So certainly this is seen in things like foster parents and foster families, but this is also seen across the state in caseworkers, social workers, mental health providers, teachers. We are seeing these levels of burnout simply because our system cannot support the amount of youth that are involved in the foster care system right now. So when we compare foster care and the amount of foster youth that we have in Nevada with our nation and with the states in the Mountain West, we see that about 4% of the nation's youth experience maltreatment overall, but only about 0.5% of those youth of all youth are involved in foster care. Again, that discrepancy is because oftentimes these experiences are going unreported and unnoticed. And so that's why we see that discrepancy. Nevada is right on the national average at that 0.5, with Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico having a lower proportion of their state's youth being in the foster care system, while Arizona is pretty significantly above that national average at 0.9. So Urie Bronfenbrenner was an American psychologist who wanted to understand the ways that we interact with our world and our world interacts with us. And so he did that by setting up this model, which is essentially, it's called a socio-ecological model. And as you can see, there are different layers to this model. And so the most center layer is the child themselves. And then as we work our way outward, we're going to see the things that have influence on them. So within that innermost layer, that microsystem, those are the things that are going to have the biggest influence on them. So their siblings, their peers, their family, their school systems. And then as we work our way out, we are going to begin to see things like social services, extended family, mass media, local and state policies. And then as we work even further, we're going to see things like our economic system, our federal policies, and our federal laws. And then we're going to work out to a global perspective. The socio-ecological model for a CPS-involved youth looks very different. As you can see, there's an immediate fracturing of that innermost layer within this system. And what we see is that there's also this coming in process from all of those outer layers now become front and center in their day-to-day lives. So these are things like the social services, as well as navigating the court system. And we see that they maintain some of their microsystem with their family of origin. However, we see other things added. So like foster families, foster siblings, potentially a new school. And so I think the best way to kind of put this into maybe an example that's easier to understand is if you were to picture yourself waking up one morning and being forced to move to a foreign country. You might have to learn how to eat new foods. You might have to wear new clothes. You might also have to learn new sets of social norms or social roles. You might have to you might be surrounded with people who look differently than you, who talk differently than you, who believe things differently than you. And this process is incredibly overwhelming. And this is what we're asking these youth to do day in and day out. I also want to state, I recognize that sometimes it's absolutely necessary for that youth safety, but we also need to recognize that this in and of itself is very overwhelming for these youth. Maltreated youth will also frequently endorse the removal from their home as an additional traumatic experience. And a subset of those youth will identify it as the most traumatic experience that they've had. So as we're thinking about this, in terms of what does it mean to have so many placements, we're thinking about this as this means that we're having this many more traumatic experiences. And as we think about the repeated exposure to that removal from home, it's going to compound their reactions, their responses, and we are going to see even greater difficulties in functioning. So for my project, we looked at maltreated youth, and we wanted to think about school outcomes. And so when we were starting this project, we kind of came to this question of, well, which comes first? Is it CPS involvement, or is there a decline in school outcomes first? And what we quickly found was that this is a really futile thought experiment. There are many risk factors that overlap for both of these groups in a pretty meaningful way. So what I mean by that is that families with physical and mental disabilities, families who have problematic substance use, social isolation, families who are living in locations with increased community violence, increased poverty, lack of community resources, areas that have poor social cohesion, as well as limited access to childcare, are at risk for both. So the question doesn't then become which one comes first so we can maybe find a way to solve it. It becomes how do we support these populations knowing that they are going to be at increased risk for both. We then wanted to also think about how does maltreatment and CPS involvement impact school outcomes. A single CPS report impacts the school's youth attendance and their achievement. So keeping in mind that's not even being removed from home, that's like step one in that process. That initial becoming in contact with the CPS system is going to immediately impact their school achievement and their school attendance. We also know that youth within the foster care are some of the most at risk for missing school, poor school performance, and problematic classroom behaviors, with CPS-involved youth having 4.1 times more unexplained or problematic absences than their non-maltreated peers. And we know that some of the reason for this is that trauma impacts our global functioning. So what do I mean by that? We're going to see impacts on a biological level, we're going to see impacts emotionally, and we're also going to see impacts cognitively. So biologically, we're going to see physical changes for these youth, whether that is through injuries and needing to take time to heal from those injuries, as well as the fact that foster youth are at increased risk for developing chronic health conditions, which leads to needing to access medical care on a more regular basis, which then again in turns impacts how often they can attend school. As they're going through that process of seeking that medical treatment, we see that there's this repeated process of trying to catch up, where they are out because they're sick or injured, and so then once they come back to school, they have to try to catch up. And then something happens again where they're maybe ill again or maybe injured again, and then again they're going through that process repeated throughout the entire year. Emotionally, we see changes in thought patterns that are often really logical and helpful in the context of surviving traumatic experiences, but tend to be really unhelpful in navigating day-to-day non-traumatic experiences. We also see a decrease in these youth's ability to regulate their emotions. So what do we mean by that? So when you have a difficult emotion, things like anger, jealousy, fear, sadness, it's going to be really difficult to come back down from that emotion. That emotion is going to feel overwhelming, and it's going to take a longer period of time and maybe higher level coping skills to come down from that emotion. We also see, cognitively, we see decreased working memory capacity, which is a youth's ability to hold information and then be able to use it effectively in school. We also see decreases in their ability to sustain attention. So to even be able to get the information in and know that the information is happening, that ability is going to be lowered as well. And what we see with this impacts on global functioning is that this is going to impact their relationships. This is going to impact how their peers see them, how their teachers interact with them, and how their administration at schools also interacts with them. Okay. So, whoops, sorry, they're stuck. Okay, so before we begin to discuss the impacts of trauma on CPS-involved youth, I want to clearly state that these youth are not to blame for their reactions to traumatic experiences. Trauma impacts everybody differently, and I'll discuss some of the common impacts, but I want to be really clear about my intention. My intention is to increase the responsibility of the adults in these youth's lives so that they can assist them through these experiences. Additionally, this is not all potential traumatic experiences, and I don't want to feed into specific potential stereotypes, but I do also recognize that some of this information can be helpful to know what to look for, especially in the classroom. So one last thing before we get fully diving into this. Each of these potential responses can also be normative throughout childhood development. And so it's not if we're seeing one of these things that we're concerned about trauma necessarily, but if we're seeing these things happening really frequently. If we're seeing multiple of these things clustering together, and if we're seeing them increase in intensity, we might start asking the question, is there something that is going on in this youth's life? So these are two essentially opposite ends of the spectrum. On this side, we have our internalizing youth. So these are going to be our silently struggling youth. You might not know that these youth are going through anything because they're not really going to probably be very visible in the classroom. So you might notice things like inattention, where it feels like they're daydreaming often, or might kind of be confused on course content a lot. They might also appear to be withdrawn, so they might not be interacting with peers, interacting with teachers, maybe as their non-maltreated peers would be. They also might appear distracted, so even if you're having a one-to-one conversation, it might seem like they're not paying attention, and it might feel like their brain is somewhere else, and most of the time, it's because it is. They're focusing on making sense of where they're at now and trying to survive. And so recognizing that those are some of that internal process that's happening. Additionally, these youth can appear to be anxious, so they might be really worried about things in school and at a level that maybe their non-maltreated peers wouldn't be. We can also see some increase in hypervigilance. So these youth are going to know exactly what's happening around the classroom at all times. They're going to know exactly who is where in the classroom. They're going to know when someone walks into the classroom that's new. They're going to know when there's a loud noise. They might have an exaggerated startle response when that's happening. And for some of our older youth, this might also look like sitting in the back of the classroom so that they can see everyone, because it feels really uncomfortable to have somebody behind you. And so this can show up in a number of different ways. Additionally, these youth might appear to be down or sad quite often. And some of these youth might appear to be really careful. They want everything to be perfect and everything to be just so, and might have a really difficult time if things aren't the way that they feel like they should be. Additionally, these youth are probably going to be pretty quiet. They're not going to be necessarily like the chatty Cathys in school and that sort of thing. Our externalizing youth, on the other end, are going to be highly visible. You're going to know exactly who these youth are the second you walk into a classroom, because they're going to be doing things that are very, very visible in that classroom. So things like engaging in impulsive behavior. So they might accidentally blurt something out. They might not be good at taking turns and waiting their turn in line. They might accidentally say something mean to a friend without thinking it through. And they might also just kind of like pop up out of their seat often and kind of sit back down depending on age. Additionally, these youth might be really talkative. So in younger folks, we might see this being like, teacher, 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 right? Always wanting that attention from the teacher. This might also look like talking to your peers a lot in class, so the kids who don't seem to kind of stay quiet in class. Or for some of our older youth, if they have phones, it could be constantly being on their phone, constantly reaching out to peers. Sometimes we can also see aggressive behaviors. So these can be things like punching, pushing, or pinching. And most of the time, again, if we're going back to that impulse behavior and difficulty regulating their emotions, most of the time they are really struggling with being able to think through those actions and have the capacity to say like, no, I don't want to do that right now. We also see these youth changing their peer groups often. And so we can see them engaging with peers who may be engaging in riskier things, such as substance use. That's a common thing that we can see for some of our more externalizing youth. We can also see a refusal to complete tasks. So sometimes this might look like a kid just kind of shoving their paper aside, not engaging in that task. Sometimes this can also look like you saying, I'm 100% not doing that, and I will let you know. Sometimes that can also take the form of yelling, either at peers, teachers, or administrators. And sometimes there's an element of hyperactivity that can also be involved. So again, that's kind of that like, I need to constantly be moving, that fidgeting behavior. In some of our older youth, that might be like, hey, I need to go to the bathroom every 5 minutes to take a lap around the school, get out some of that, that activity level. Sometimes this can also take the form of inappropriate sexual behaviors, so touching themselves at an inappropriate time, touching other students at inappropriate time, or even talking about sexual topics at inappropriate times with inappropriate audiences. And again, that is going to kind of differ depending on age groups. So with our older youth, that might be a little bit more difficult to figure out, but with some of our younger youth, that's going to look like talking about things that aren't at a developmental appropriate level that we would assume that they'd be at. Additionally, with our externalizing youth, we also know that these youth are going to be more likely to experience punitive consequences and actions for these responses. So now not only are they having these responses to trauma, they're also being told your response to that trauma is wrong and you should be doing something different about it. And so again, as we're thinking about the ways that the systems interact with these youth, we need to be really careful about how we are potentially sending that message to these youth. So why are school outcomes for CPS-involved youth important? The impacts of education have pretty routinely been shown to be important in things like career opportunities, socioeconomic status, and earning potential. However, we also know that the highest level of education attained is also heavily correlated with social well-being, mental well-being, and physical well-being. So we're not just talking about education because education is important and everybody should get one. We're also talking about this specifically because it's a proxy for quality of life throughout the lifespan. In order to look at that within these youth, we looked at school outcomes such as school absenteeism, school achievement, and classroom behaviors, again, because those map on really well to that highest level of education attained. So problematic school absenteeism is defined by missing 10% of school days throughout the year. And while that might sound like a fair amount, it's just 18 days. 18 days of school attendance, or 3.5 weeks throughout the year. And while the reasons for missing school vary child by child, many have similar outcomes, including decreased school achievement, delayed graduation, and increased school dropout rates. School achievement is specifically talking about how well you're performing in school. So typically this is measured through things like grades or performance on standardized tests. And school achievement is heavily linked to school absenteeism. If you're not at school, you're not learning that material. And most of the time, again, we're back to that repeated I need to catch up process. Classroom behaviors is specifically talking about the way that the child acts when they're in the classroom. Specifically within our study, thinking about if disciplinary action was needed for those behaviors in the classroom. When we're talking about that classroom behavior piece, it becomes really important because these students are less likely to get the benefit of the doubt from teachers of, oh, you missed that assignment, hey, I'll give you an extension, kind of some of those social currency pieces that everybody kind of has on a day-to-day basis. And we know that CPS involved youth, again, are that increased risk for poor school attendance, school achievement, and classroom behaviors. So my study is looking at the impact of the lifetime number of placements on school outcomes. And for our study, we partnered with Child Haven, which is an emergency group home here in Las Vegas, who have youth living there who have been emergently removed from their homes. And the youth in our study ranged in age 10 to 17 years old. Our data collection included a combination of PTSD assessments as well as record reviews at Child Haven. And throughout the course of our study, 235 children and adolescents participated. However, after checking to make sure that all necessary variables were present for each participant, only 170 participants were kept within our analyses. Okay, so really the main goal of the present study was to have easy and identifiable markers for assessing which youth within foster care were most at risk for these negative school outcomes. So the variables that we used demographic variables, so things like age, race, and we also looked at the lifetime number of placements. Within that, we also looked at the type of placement, whether that's a group home, a foster home, an inpatient psychiatric unit. Where are these youth staying and how is that potentially impacting their school outcomes? And then lastly, we included our school outcome variables. So that's your classroom behavior, school achievement, and school attendance. We broke up the number of placements into 3 time categories. So 6 months the 6 months immediately prior to the assessment, the 1 year immediately prior to the assessment, and throughout these youth lifetimes. And what we found was that at the 6 months mark, the range for the number of placements was 1 to 13, with the most frequent occurrences being at about 1 to 6 placements, as well as having, and then when we move to the 1 year, we see that range expand from 1 to 20. For our youth, with the most frequent being in that 1 to 10. So again, that increases for just about all of our participants. And then at the lifetime level, the range is 1 to 63. And the most frequent of those placements occurring from that 1 to 19 mark. But there was also a substantial group within that 20 to 30 mark as well. So we're really seeing kind of a change in the total number of placements for these youth kind of at each of those markers. The participants in our study, again, ranged in age from 10 to 17, with the majority of our youth being in the 12 to 17 age ranges. Our participants' gender, 49.4 were female, 46.7 were male, with 2.9% of our participants being somewhere in the trans and non-binary umbrella. For our participants' race and ethnicity, our largest group were Black youth within our study, being followed by multiracial, and then white, and then Hispanic youth. We did have several youth who endorsed being from different racial backgrounds or ethnic backgrounds. However, due to our sample size, we stayed consistent with what psychological research shows to group them together so that we don't lose those participants in our study. So our primary findings, what does all of this amount to? So we completed individual binomial logistic regressions to essentially determine if there was any predictive value between the lifetime number of placements on those school outcomes. And what we found was that the total number of lifetime placements was not statistically significant or explainable by chance alone for predicting problematic school achievement or school attendance. However, the lifetime number of placements was statistically significant for predicting problematic classroom behaviors, such that for after 8 placements, every increase in 9 placements throughout a participant's lifetime, they were 2 times more likely to have problematic classroom behaviors. We then ran models to see for who and when does this apply. So some of the variables that we included in that were race. Again, due to our sample size, we dichotomized our race so that we had white and non-white participants as our group there. We also included age, whether they were assessed before or after the COVID-19 shutdown, and the days since their first CPS record within the state of Nevada. And what we found was that regardless of race, age, time of assessment, and longevity in DCFS, all youth were still 2 times more likely to have problematic classroom behaviors with that increase in 9 placements over their lifetime. So what this means is that those variables do not have as much influence as the amount of placements that you've had throughout your life. Additionally, what we found is that older participants were 1.2 times more likely to experience problematic school attendance, regardless of race, time of assessment, longevity in DCFS, and their lifetime number of placements. This is really consistent with the school absenteeism literature and showing that age is one of our best predictors for which youth are more likely to have problematic school attendance. We then ran models to see if the types of placement these youth were in is going to have an impact on how they're functioning and those school outcome variables. And what we found, again, was that there was no meaningful impact on these types of, on placement types for that problematic school achievement and school attendance. But again, however, we saw that for youth who have been in inpatient treatment centers just twice throughout their lifetime are 1.5 times more likely to have problematic classroom behaviors. So now that we know this, what does it mean? What do we do with it? So the research implications, the long and the short of it is we need more research. So that research needs to look like bigger sample sizes so that we can include more nuanced understanding of those demographic variables that we just weren't able to do in this study. We also need to look at longitudinal analyses, being able to track these youth over a period of time to see when are they doing well, what supports were in place, and when are they not doing well, and what did those supports look like. Additionally, we need some exploratory analyses. So we have some markers and we have some ideas as to what might be a good model in predicting these school outcome variables. However, are there even better models that maybe we're not thinking of right now? Additionally, we need some improved measures. So our data is only ever going to be as good as our measures. And right now, the Department of Family Services here in Nevada uses an assessment called the Child Assessment of Needs and Strengths. And this assessment is not very specific, which means that we're losing a bunch of youth kind of in the weeds of that assessment. So to Also, I also want to add that that's pretty on par with the rest of the nation. The rest of the nation pretty standardly uses that assessment in Department of Family Services. However, I would encourage our Department of Family Services to begin to think about what other assessments can we use so that we can identify these youth in a much more specified way to be able to provide some of that support. Additionally, we need increased access to research. Maltreated youth are a protected population and absolutely should be. However, we need some way to do research. We don't want to not be able to understand some of these variables due to trying to keep some of that protection. There are some lower risk ways that we can do research, particularly if there was a built-in position at the State Department level that could perform some of this research on records, so that they're being able to look at some of that existing data at very little impact for these youth. Additionally, we need to move towards applied research in general. And this is really across disciplines. So this can be things like teachers, this can be things like nursing or medical professions or across mental health professions, so that we can work to be able to identify some of these most at-risk youth and to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of the care that they're receiving. Which then takes me to my policy implications. So there are two primary policy implications that I want to focus on. The first is moving towards a trauma-informed school system here in the state of Nevada, as well as increasing access to mental health services. So trauma-informed school systems have been shown to be beneficial for all students, not just CPS-involved youth. However, the benefits for CPS-involved youth are exponential when working from a trauma-informed school system approach. What do I mean by that specifically? I mean a school system that can identify and assess for traumatic stress, as well as addressing and treating that traumatic stress within the school system. Also having a way to provide trauma education and awareness for its teachers, its administrators, its students, and its parents, as well as being able to build partnerships with students and families. So working towards building some of that social cohesion that we know is going to be a protective factor for these youth, as well as creating a trauma-informed learning environment. So what are the ways we can reduce some of those responses naturally by the way we're approaching school, by the way we're approaching instruction, as well as cultural responsiveness and emergency management. So currently in the state of Nevada, there's no policy on having teachers or administrators take required professional developmental courses to learn about how to implement a trauma-informed school system. I recognize that there's a variety of stakeholders with each varying a level of influence, knowledge, and resources. However, they can help build and develop an infrastructure for these trauma-informed school systems. Some of these stakeholders include our school districts, our boards of trustees, the Nevada Department of Education, the Teachers Union, Nevada Psychological Association, CASA, and the Children's Advocacy Alliance. So in order to work towards enacting some policy change, it would be wonderful if these different stakeholders could get together and be able to talk about their spheres of influence, their allocation of resources, and whether or not legislative action is required for moving towards a trauma-informed school approach. And if a legislative action is in fact needed to enact this, having group cohesion towards a unified goal is going to help that process get through much quicker. Additionally, I want to also talk about the ways that we can use a trauma-informed school system within an already existing policy. So the Every Student Succeeds Act was signed into Nevada policy in December of 2015. And this policy allows and affords youth within the foster care system certain educational rights, one of which is to stay at their school of origin, if that is determined to be for their betterment. We also know that the schools that these youth are more likely to get a report from tend to be underfunded and have lower levels of access to resources. So if we were to provide some of those additional supports within those specific schools, there'd be a higher chance that that youth could stay at their school of origin and helping this policy be more effective in what it's actually trying to do. For example, increasing the number of school psychologists and school-based care can provide some meaningful ways to increase the likelihood that they can stay at their schools. I get that on paper, that sounds really nice, and that we have a severe shortage of school psychologists in the state of Nevada. And that takes me to some of our next policy implications is mental health care access in the state of Nevada. So Nevada, in response to the Department of Justice's report, put together a plan for children's behavioral health care services. This plan was recently approved by the Legislative Interim Finance Committee with allocating $200 million towards increasing wraparound services. And they're doing that specifically through expanding Medicaid and an already existing hospital tax. As a part of this plan, they are trying to build on the already existing infrastructure by increasing screening and early intervention services, outpatient and community services, acute intervention services, and residential and inpatient services. One of the most crucial aspects of this plan that absolutely needs to be a sole focus of attention is increasing outpatient and community services for youth specifically. Within the community, average wait times to get into a child psychologist tend to be anywhere from 6 months to a year, depending on the time of year that we're at. That is way too long for these youth to wait for these services. And what we will frequently see is an escalation in the severity of their behaviors and potentially their mental health concerns. And what happens at that point is then acute psychiatric inpatient care is needed. So going back to some of the results from this study, if we are able to increase our outpatient and community services, we can effectively reduce a CPS youth-involved risk for disruptive classroom behaviors through reducing the number of inpatient stays that these youth are having. One thing that this mental health plan does not talk about, but I would hope would be a part of that conversation, is a need for insurance reform in the state of Nevada, specifically for mental and behavioral health. So there are two things that frequently come up in that circle when we're talking about insurance. One is needing a higher reimbursement rate. Right now, there was a recent study that came out that's showing on average nationally, medical providers receive reimbursement rates at a 21.7% higher than their behavioral health counterparts. So that means that we are not being provided the fees that essentially our services are worth. Additionally, another thing that comes up is a quicker response for paneling. There are some psychologists that I've talked to that have waited like upwards of 2 years, maybe even more, to hear back from insurances to try to get paneled for insurance. And so that process is 2 years and or more that these providers could have been providing that mental health to families who can't otherwise afford that access to mental health care. So one thing that could be very helpful in this next legislative session is thinking about ways that we can incentivize those insurance companies to have a quicker turnaround time for those providers and increasing our reimbursement rates for mental and behavioral health providers. I will say that's not going to solve everything though. When we talk about mental health in the state of Nevada, we can't have a conversation about that without talking about retention of mental health providers. So I want to start by saying I can't speak from all mental health professions, but I can speak to doctoral level training in the state of Nevada. So a part of our training is that we are, the very end and last year, we are required to engage in an intensive clinical year of training as a required portion of our degree. APA accreditation is something within those internship sites that affords some of the rigor to make sure that we are meeting those competencies to be an effective psychologist when we leave the field. So, and additionally, another part of APA accreditation is that many jobs require us to have attended an APA accredited internship site. What that means is if once we've graduated, if we are seeking a job at the VA, for example, which is the largest employer across the nation for psychologists, we cannot get that job because we did not have an APA accredited internship. So that's how important this piece is. If you, when we're talking about retention of child psychologists specifically, we know that psychologists are more likely to end in one of two places, where they grew up or where they completed their training. So now I'm going to turn your attention to the map. So the map is showing the proportion of APA accredited sites in each Mountain West state that serve children. Nevada is the only state who has 0 APA accredited internship sites. So when we're talking about trying to bring people to Nevada, that becomes really difficult. We are relying on people who grew up here when we are not actively recruiting them. Additionally, with the exception of New Mexico, as a total number, we have about 1/3 of the APA accredited sites by comparison to our other states in the Mountain West, which means that as a whole, we are bringing less psychologists to our state. Give me 1 second. Okay, so sorry, I lost my place a little bit. Okay, so for example, my cohort had 8 people in it here at UNLV, 3 of which grew up here in Nevada. Only 2 of us are staying, myself being one of them. And similar stories can be seen through the 4 cohorts above me, as well as some of the hearing what plans of students below me in cohorts are saying that their future plans are. Additionally, in my cohort, there are 2 incredibly talented child-focused future psychologists, and both have stated that they would stay here if there was somewhere for them to train. Right now, Nevada is effectively training psychologists for other states. Public dollars are being invested to export mental health resources because we can't retain our psychologists, and most importantly, our children's psychologists. For relatively small investments, Nevada has the capacity to change the environment for children's mental health. So 2 areas of focus to work towards some of that retention is increasing the number of APA internship sites, as well as increasing the number of postdoctoral positions, so where we go after we've graduated with our degrees. Some of the states, most notably Arizona and Utah, part of the reasons that they have such high levels of APA accredited sites is because a number of those are something that's called a consortium. Essentially what that means is that multiple sites have gotten together and said, let's work together to make sure we can meet the APA requirements so that we can train psychologists and bring them here to our state. What would be really helpful in this process of trying to increase this number is a state-funded position, potentially by a psychologist in the Department of Health and Human Services here in Nevada, whose primary focus is setting up these APA accredited sites. We have wonderful training places here. I've been at some of them. Some of them include Child Haven, Desert Willow, Boys Town, Sunrise Hospital, and Care for the Kids. Also, the practice at UNLV is another notable one. It would be, we could see some big changes in how many APA accredited sites if these sites would talk to each other and work towards that accreditation together and have somebody who could fill that workload. We also don't want to rely on state funding alone. So one of the things, our Senate Bill 150 was a bill that was not passed this last legislative session. The sole intention of that bill was to allow doctoral interns and postdocs, so non-fully licensed psychologists, to bill insurance. And why that is important is we have a number of really talented, wonderful psychologists here in our state who have stated that training and supervision is something that is very important to them and is a primary value to them, but they can't do it because they don't have the money to. And so In passing bills such as that, there can be a way for these psychologists to start to build some of those necessary steps to have the training infrastructure in our state. Additionally, the second piece that I was talking about is the postdoctoral opportunities. So once we're done with our degree, how are we going to stay here? So the next step is to be able to apply for jobs and apply for postdoctoral positions. Out of the 10 Southern Nevada current interns who are currently in the southern part of the state, 5 of them grew up here in Nevada. So we're not struggling for people who want to come here because they grew up here. However, these people are struggling to find postdoc positions. It's to the point where I know several people who have cold emailed people to say, will you please take a postdoctoral student next year because I want to stay in the state of Nevada. If we can't even have the positions for the people who want to be here and who grew up here, we certainly are not recruiting people from other states. So we need to be thinking about building out those sites to allow for some of that retention and recruitment. Lastly, when working with clients from a dialectical behavioral therapy approach, we often focus on understanding dialectics, which is 2 things that seem opposingly opposite, but are true at the same time. And a common dialectic that we come to is that we're doing our best and we need to do better. Nevada is currently doing its best to implement changes for foster youth mental health, and we still need to do better. Investing in foster youth, school systems, mental health services is ultimately investing in Nevada's future. Through implementing policies, improving school-based mental health services in schools that have higher percentage of CPS reports, the implementation of training towards a trauma-informed school system, and policies to improve in training and the retention of mental health professionals in Nevada, Nevada could see significant changes in our economy and, more importantly, in the lives of the people within our communities. Nevada can no longer afford to be reactive and needs to work towards becoming proactive in finding and implementing meaningful solutions to our mental health, school systems, and foster care system crises. And thank you. I appreciate your time. Additionally, if you are interested, that QR code will send you to a link, or you can send me your email if you're interested in seeing my dissertation. Once it's completed, I'll make sure that it gets your way.
All right, thank you, Mallory.
Thank you.
Wonderful work, wonderful work. Thank you so much. So one little last order of business this afternoon, and that is to announce next year's Lang Fellow. And it'll be Amelia Terry. Unfortunately, she's not able to join us today, but like Mallory, she grew up in Las Vegas. She did her undergraduate at UNLV, theme here, and she's completing her PhD in public health. In between, she's worked in public affairs and in advocacy for healthcare. Her dissertation examines health disparities in the LGBTQIA plus community, and we hope to see you back here next spring when she delivers her lecture. In the meantime, if you would like to support the Lang Fellow, the QR code is inside the program, so please take advantage of that, and thank you all once again for coming.